On a freezing January day in 1649, the executioner's axe ended the reign and the life of King Charles I. It was the final melancholy episode in one of England's saddest stories. Sent to his death by a parliament weary of his duplicity, the king met his end with dignity and courage. Behind him, he left a kingdom still scarred and divided by the English civil wars. During the early years of the 17th century, the quiet shires and peaceful towns of England enjoyed a long period of peace that was finally shattered by the unparalleled conflict that burst fully into life during 1642. That unhappy time has become known as the English Civil Wars, even though the tumultuous events also involved Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Ultimately, no corner of the British Isles was left untouched by a bloody and tragic war that set brother against brother and father against son. In a letter to his brother, Ralph, the MP Edmund Verney wrote,
"Brother, what I feared is proved to be true, which is your being against the king. Give me leave to tell you, in my opinion, 'tis most unhandsomely done, and it grieves my heart to think that my father already, and I, who so dearly esteem you, should be bound to be your enemy. I hear 'tis a great grief to my father."
The English Civil War was in many senses the most traumatic set of events in English history. It led not only to large numbers of people being killed, because that has happened elsewhere in English history, one can think of the First World War, but crucially to large numbers of people being killed by their neighbours, by their members of their extended family, by other people who were from the same country.
James Spencer, a reluctant royalist soldier, wrote to his wife in September 1641,
"The discontent that I and many other honest men receive daily is beyond expression. People are much divided, and the king is of late very averse to peace. This is lightning before death."
The origins of the English Civil War are complex, and a host of historical interpretations, not all free from vested interests, have failed to establish a single clear-cut cause. The events of nearly 400 years ago are even more obscured not just by the passing of time, but by the activities of propagandists on both sides, even up to the present day.
Marks the service of those whose membership dates from the early days of the King's Army.
The causes of the war that set Englishmen against Englishmen stemmed from a process of evolution, a process that some have seen as the transformation of the church and constitution from a medieval society into a modern nation-state.
There is a lot of debate about the root causes of the English Civil War. Some will have it as a religious conflict, some people will have it as a political conflict, some people even class it as a class conflict. It's difficult to say that those are actually the root causes. The root causes are probably more likely the demographics of the English population.
Roughly a doubling of the English and Welsh population caused all sorts of problems: unemployment, poverty. Some social groups did relatively badly in that period, some of the masses with poverty. Also at the other end of the social scale, the elite, the aristocracy. Some historians suggest that they were struggling a little bit, 1540 to 1640. Conversely, other social groups, such as the rural gentry, such as the urban mercantile communities, probably getting stronger.
The accelerating pace of progress during the long peace of the 16th and 17th centuries had imposed intolerable strains on the feudal structures by which the people of England were governed. In the fields of art, science, theology and commerce, old boundaries were constantly being pushed back, and the process of Renaissance, a cultural and scientific rebirth, that had dragged Europe out of the Middle Ages was, by now, almost complete. England was, despite the tensions, a peaceful and prosperous nation at last. Continual advances in trade and industry were creating an increasingly sophisticated society that many believed needed new, more modern forms of government. As the merchant class expanded, so the demands for a voice in its own affairs grew louder. It also began to explore new forms of religious worship. Among those who sought change, however, the precise nature of what the new society needed had yet to be fully defined. Throughout the nation, there was a heated debate on matters of government, commerce, and religion that eventually came to form two distinct parties. For some Englishmen, constitutional change was the goal. For others, greater freedom of trade was the burning issue of the day. For those who were most determined to fashion change, however, it was religious reform that mattered most, and it was this issue that lay at the root of the divisions in English society during the late 1630s and early 1640s.
England and Wales went through a reformation in the 16th century, as a result of which they broke from Rome and became Protestantised. There's a minority who remain Roman Catholic, but by the 17th century they're a very small minority. They're not really a political problem, they don't cause trouble. The real issue is, where's the Church of England as a Protestant church going to go? How far down the lines of Protestantism is it to progress? And there's a tension in the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods between those who want to push the Reformation further, who want to do away with some of the Catholic hangovers in terms of the trinkets, the ceremonials, in terms of the structure of the church, and push it further along a Protestant, what we might call low church line. And there are those who say, no, we've gone far enough, it's a perfectly good, part Catholic, but essentially Protestant compromise.
Religion was important, certainly in helping to account for those people who were particularly partisan, particularly active. And in any civil war, it's the activists that tend to be most important, certainly in the early stages. There is no doubt that those who were puritanically disposed were inclined to be parliamentarian, and those who were crypto-Catholics were inclined to be royalists.
Because of the deep suspicion of the court and its possible Catholic sympathies, the parliamentary side enjoyed far greater popular support among ordinary folk. A proportion, however, clung to their traditional loyalties to the crown and were unrepresented in Parliament. The royalist cause was better represented among the gentry and landowning aristocracy, many of whom owed their position and privileges to the Stuarts. It was, Nevertheless, some members from these sections of the population that were most vocal in their opposition to their government. There was, therefore, no clear class division, but the entire nation was at odds. The country was splitting apart.
Across the country, it is possible to always find supporters of both sides. For example, there were parliamentarians in Cornwall, which was overwhelmingly a royalist county. There were royalists in Norfolk, which was overwhelmingly a parliamentary county. Also, among every single occupational group, one can find people on both sides. You can find aristocrats on both sides. You can find progressive landlords interested in new agricultural methods on both sides, and conservative landlords on both sides.
However heartfelt the causes on both sides, one thing was sure. Any move towards reform would inevitably mean a collision with King Charles I. Charles' father, James VI of Scotland, had ascended the throne of England left vacant by the childless Elizabeth I in 1603, and had so become both James VI of Scotland and James I of England. When he succeeded his father, Charles was therefore only the second king to rule both kingdoms of Scotland and England, which were still separate countries in every legal and economic sense.
From 1603, the King of England and Wales ruled not only those countries, but also Ireland and also Scotland. And so we've got what some historians refer to as the British problem, the problem of multiple kingdoms. A single person, a king, trying to rule three very different, disparate nations with different social structures, different laws, different religion and so on. And all those create long-term pressures and tensions within the English and British state in the decades before the English Civil War broke out.
King Charles was a man of great principle and conviction, but he was a man totally opposed to the kind of change advocated by large sections of his people.
Charles's role of king is often summed up in the terms divine right, and this is often taken to mean an absolutist monarch whose word is law, with no consideration for his country. But in actual fact, this doesn't cover it very well, because Charles himself was very aware that as the king, as king by divine right of God, he was responsible for the country. He saw himself as the shepherd of the country. On the other hand, Charles saw that anybody who hindered him in his performance of that role, who didn't cooperate with him fully, was working against the country. And this is one of the reasons why he had the conflict with Parliament, in that Parliament saw that their role in the governing of the country was more important perhaps than the king's, hence the conflict.
Charles distrusted parliaments absolutely, and had governed the country for long periods without recourse to one. A revealing insight into his opinion of them came in an address to the Lords and the Commons in 1626. Its arrogance set the tone for his dealings with the people's representatives for the rest of his life.
Remember that parliaments are altogether in my own power for their calling, sitting, and dissolution. Therefore, as I find the fruits of them good or evil, they are to continue or not to be. And remember that if you persist in your errors, you make them greater and irreconcilable. Whereas if you do go on cheerfully to mend them, you will do yourselves honour and shall encourage me to go on with parliaments.
Charles I's problems with Parliament, in particular their unwillingness to finance his policies, their uncertainty about his autocratic attitudes, and their unhappiness with his clerical politics, led in 1629 to the king to decide to rule without Parliament, the so-called personal rule, which lasted from 1629 to 1640. Now, to rule without Parliament was not illegal, but what it in many senses encapsulated was a determination on the king's part to to follow his own views and not in any way to heed advice or to accept compromise.
Charles' failure to call a parliament meant that there was no effective platform for national debate, and, consequently, the simmering unrest that continued to ferment beneath the surface of English society had no real outlet. This was to have disastrous consequences for Charles when he was eventually forced by events to recall Parliament. With his inflexible views on kingship and his equally intransigent stance on the central role of the Church of England, the king and his supporters represented a common obstacle to change in all of the main areas in which many of his subjects demanded reform. Inevitably, they were soon being seen as the enemy. In the 17th century, there was still a great deal of reverence for the position of the sovereign, and even his severest opponents stopped short of hostility towards the king himself. Their enmity was reserved not for the king, but for his evil counsellors. Chief among these was Charles' close friend and confidant, Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford.
Having dissolved Parliament, Charles needed people to assist him to run the country, and Thomas Wentworth, who was a Yorkshireman, has been described as forcing his way into government. He was chairman of the Council of the North, he was governor of Ireland, but more importantly, his role fitted nicely with Charles's vision of kingship. Wentworth was able to use his tasks, to use the jobs that Charles set him, to improve his own condition, to increase his own personal wealth and power, but at the same time supply the king with what he needed.
For most of the 1630s, he's not in England and Wales, he's in Ireland, the king's governor in Ireland. And in Ireland, he pushes through quite ruthlessly and tactlessly the sort of policies that Charles was trying to or hoping to push through in England and Wales. We see things like the elevation of royal authority. The king's word is law and must be obeyed. Right at the end of the 1630s, as one of the key confidants of Charles I, he is recalled to England and Wales. He's raised to the peerage as the Earl of Strafford, and he is there to put bite into the king, to give him backbone. He does support the recalling of Parliament in the late 1630s, but it's a Parliament that should do the king's bidding. And with the army that he had built up and raised in Ireland in the late 1630s, he offers Charles an alternative route forward, possibly using this Irish army to back up his own position in England and Wales.
Eventually, the various groups seeking to change English society formed into a single party that was directly opposed to the Royalists. These zealous groups became generally known as Puritans.
Puritanism was derived from a belief that the Protestant Reformation had not gone far enough. The Anglican Church, the Arminian Church, saw itself as the logical successor to the Reformation. But the growing belief on the continent, and it was a belief that was brought into England by various scholars, was this Reformation had not gone far enough.
They see or they believe that the Church of England, their faith, is under great threat, that things are moving backwards in a Catholic direction, and they are increasingly worried about where it's going. And it's no coincidence that in the 1640s, as the political situation broke down, it's many of this Puritan group, Puritan clique, Puritan party, whatever we call it, who come to the fore early on in the parliamentary cause as the leader of that cause, the most outspoken critics of Charles's religious and broader political and constitutional policies.
Charles himself certainly wished to see not simply moves against any inclination towards Puritanism, but also wanted to see a tightening of aspects of church doctrine, church liturgy, church ceremonial, all of which offended a large number of people.
An already difficult situation was not helped when it was learned that the Catholic Henrietta Maria, the king's French wife, was being allowed to maintain her own private priests. Low profile though this private arrangement was, it attracted harsh criticism. As Catholicism was held in such deep suspicion, the fact that the Queen of England was herself a Catholic was a source of considerable unease for the more extreme factions of the population who saw a papist plot lurking in every corner. There was also the constant fear that Charles himself might be converted to the Catholic faith.
Charles's attitudes, his fascination with many respects of ritual, his fascination with many aspects of Catholic culture, made him in many senses very amenable to the idea of Catholicism.
Although religion was the major factor in the escalation of national unrest, it was economic issues arising from the religious discontent that would finally light the fuse and plunge the country into civil war. Not content with imposing a new, rigid form of worship on the Church of England, Charles sought to extend his reforms to the Church of Scotland. In doing so, he committed a fatal error. Charles attempted to impose a new Anglican Book of Common Prayer, written by the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, on the Presbyterian Church of Scotland.
Laud looked at Scotland and saw that the Scottish system, which was a Presbyterian system, where each church was a separate committee within the structure with no bishops, and they sought to impose the English order on the Scottish Church. Consequently, they imposed a new prayer book, which denied the Scottish one of their two forms of communion, their choice. Naturally, there was a riot.
Scotland was united in its outrage, and a national covenant in defence of its own fiercely Protestant religion was signed. This led the country into open conflict with the king, for the covenant bound every able-bodied man and woman with a vow to protect their religious liberties. Ominously for King Charles, the Scots set about raising an army of the covenant. In two short wars during 1639 and 1640, Charles's armies were defeated and humiliated by the Scots Covenanters in two almost farcical conflicts, which are remembered as the Bishops' Wars. Charles' father, James I, employing great skills, had managed to achieve the seemingly impossible. He had successfully reintroduced bishops into the Scottish Presbyterian system. Charles, with his high-handed attitude, managed to undo all of his father's achievements, as the Scots threw out the bishops and took up arms against him. The outcome of these two short and relatively bloodless wars proved to be an unmitigated military disaster for King Charles. The Scots army easily defeated the hastily assembled English forces thrown against them at the Battle of Newburn, before marching on to occupy Newcastle. Charles was now virtually bankrupt. He certainly had insufficient funds to pay his army, who reacted by deserting in droves. So it was that, for the first time in 1,000 years of cross-border warfare, the city of Newcastle upon Tyne fell into Scottish hands, and it was they who dictated surrender terms to the king.
The crisis known as the Bishops' War forced Charles to address the issue of how he was to fund the British state. After all, if his authority in the British state was to rest fundamentally on the power of England, including hopefully the ability of England to coerce Scotland, then he would have to finance a larger army, because the English army in the 1630s was small. Had Charles beat the Scots, then this crisis might not have arisen, or it might have been a short-term crisis. But what one sees at the end of the 1630s and in 1640 is the combination of a military crisis, the failure to coerce the Scots, and indeed the successful Scottish invasion of northern England, and a political crisis.
With the hostile Scots army before him and an increasingly unruly Parliament at his back, Charles recognised that, for the moment at least, he could not bend Scotland to his will by force. With the pig-headedness that was to typify Charles' rule, he performed an amazing about-turn and travelled to Edinburgh in a forlorn attempt to court Scots' assistance. Charles realised that he was now on the verge of a war with his own Parliament, and that he needed to neutralise and pacify the Scots in order that he could deal with his English problems undistracted. The king's attempt to win over his erstwhile enemies in Scotland was to prove futile. His visit to Scotland was a complete failure, as the Scots, not surprisingly, made it clear that they could hardly support the same monarch who had so recently attempted to deprive them of their religious liberties. For the time being, however, they agreed that they would not oppose Charles either. But when the war in England eventually came, the Scots were to stand menacingly on the sidelines, waiting to see the outcome. Militarily, the Bishops' War had been a shambles, but worse still for Charles was the financial cost of waging war. For 11 years he had ruled the country without recourse to Parliament, a period frequently referred to by his opponents as the 11-year tyranny. He was now about to pay the price for his autocratic stewardship of the country, for during those 11 years he had had to raise money to govern the country by twisting and manipulating taxation laws, as well as taking full advantage of the sovereign's right to grant monopolies. The king's financial management of the country created huge unrest among the merchant class, who objected strongly to royal monopolies being granted on, among many other things, the manufacture of soap and salt. Furthermore, the reintroduction and extension of dormant taxes like ship money further fanned the flames of revolt. Of all the measures put into place by Charles to raise funds, ship money is probably the most infamous. The tax was supposed to be levied in time of war on coastal counties only, in order to pay for the naval defences of the country. But in 1636, Charles ruled that it should be collected nationwide and made ship money a regular tax. There was little opposition to the measure at first, but gradually discontent grew until in 1637 John Hampden, a wealthy landowner and Member of Parliament from Buckinghamshire, went to the High Court to bring what became a test case for the tax. A majority of the High Court judges ruled in favour of the king's right to levy the tax, but the margin was very small, and most people viewed the result as a moral victory for those opposed to collection of ship money. Although it was not as a direct result of the Hampden case, within 2 years the tax had become virtually impossible to administer, and funds had all but ceased to find their way to the Treasury. Charles may have asked himself if it was all worth the trouble, for the revenues these highly unpopular measures raised proved insufficient even to keep the king's coffers in order, far less finance a war.
It was tradition that a parliament should be called before or on going to war. An exception in 1639, Charles I had gone to war against the Scots, the first Scots or Bishops' War, without calling an English parliament. He tried to raise money elsewhere. That war had gone disastrously wrong and left him hugely in debt. Nothing daunted, Charles I was looking to go to war against the Scots again in 1640, but this time it was fairly clear to him or to his chief advisors, such as the Earl of Strafford, that he really had to call Parliament to get their support and get money. And that's why in spring 1640, for the first time in 11 years, Charles I calls a Parliament in England and Wales, the Parliament that becomes known as the Short Parliament. Far from granting him quick, ready money for the Scottish War, it has its own shopping list of criticisms and grievances, religious, political, constitutional, built up over the previous 11 years, which it wants addressed first.
In a fury, Charles dismissed them in May 1640. But, after the failure of the Second Bishops' War, he was soon forced to call another, the so-called Long Parliament of November 1640. This was even more hostile in its demands. Skillfully marshalled by the arch-politician John Pym, Parliament introduced legislation that made dissolution impossible until its grievance had been dealt with.
Under Pym's leadership, they pushed through a range of political constitutional reforms. They ensure that the present Parliament, the Long Parliament, can't be dissolved without its own consent. They ensure that henceforward under Triennial Act, no more than 3 years should elapse between the dissolution of one Parliament and the summoning of the next Parliament. They remove most of the non-parliamentary financial measures that Charles had relied upon during the personal rule, so things like ship money go are declared illegal. They also remove most of the key prerogative courts, the King's courts that he'd used to push through his government in the 1630s, things like the Court of High Commission, the Court of Star Chamber.
The people that met did not think that there was going to be a revolution. What they wanted was reform. What they wanted was a monarch who would listen to them, who would remove unpopular ministers, and who would in some way engage in a new partnership.
The establishment of the Long Parliament proved a vital blow to the king's fortunes, for his opponents sensed their opportunity and had no intention of letting it slip. Parliament had in its sights the king's closest advisers, particularly the Earl of Strafford and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Strafford was impeached and sent to the Tower of London only a few days after Parliament convened. Early in December 1640, Archbishop Laud joined him there. Deprived of his closest allies and most trusted advisers, King Charles was lost. It was now that he began to fall increasingly under the influence of Henrietta Maria, who offered her husband sincere but ill-informed advice. Of course he could and should re-establish royal absolutism, she insisted. He should make no concessions to Parliament, she counselled. Sadly for the king, his wife had no concept of the depth of feeling among the English gentry against her husband or his position. If the vast majority had no wish for a republic, they were certainly determined to have a king who operated within the constraints of a constitutional monarchy. In February 1641, Charles, with great reluctance and ill grace, assented to the Triennial Act that stated that a new Parliament must be called no more than 3 years after the dissolution of the previous Parliament. Now the king was forced to look on as the trial of his great friend Strafford for treason began on 22nd March in Westminster Hall. As Charles watched the impeachment proceedings from his royal box, surely one thing was furthest from his mind, that less than 8 years later, he too would one day stand on trial for his life in that very same place.
It was very important that Parliament could not attack the institution of the king himself. So they sought to chip away his position by attacking the people that supported him, in particular Wentworth and Laud. The Earl of Strafford, Thomas Wentworth, was a very clever, astute man, and he managed to actually almost evade the case, the legal case put to him against him by Parliament. However, Parliament still had one trick up the sleeves, the Bill of Attainder. It's been described as legalised murder.
The problem with a bill, a piece of legislation, is that it needs the King's assent before it can have any effect. So landing on the King's desk is this bill. It's passed the House of Commons and the House of Lords. He agonises, he tries to negotiate with Parliament for some sort of a punishment less than death, banishment, exile, whatever. He tries to get his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, to plead on Strafford's behalf. Pym and Parliament has nothing to do with that. No, only the full act of attainder, complete with the death sentence, will do. And eventually, with Parliament baying for justice and with increasing disorder in London crowds coming out, pushing for the act of attainder, pushing for execution, Charles gives way and he does sign that act. The act is then put into effect.
The doomed Earl wrote in May 1641,
"Put not your trust in princes."
In November 1641, Parliament presented King Charles with the Grand Remonstrance, a list of 201 objections to his governmental methods.
The Great Remonstrance was actually fuelled by the fact that Parliament needed to make a major effort. The treaty with the Scots that Charles signed, in many people's eyes, was a sellout of English religion. And they could see that the king had been forced into this by Parliament. So people that had previously supported Parliament were angry. And Parliament needed to take a step that would show that they were back in control of the situation.
The Grand Remonstrance is debated in a rather thin House of Commons. It eventually passes by a thin majority, just by 11 votes. And in the debate on the Grand Remonstrance, on the divisions in the House of Commons that the Grand Remonstrance reveals, we can begin to see two parties. The King is now gaining a political party, constitutional royalists, who perhaps will rally to him and give him a party if it moves from a political sphere to a military sphere. Against him there are those die-hard reformists who will carry on and push through and become the basis of the parliamentary party in the Civil War.
Events were now moving quickly. With each passing day, the position of the two sides became more entrenched, and the likelihood of a peaceful resolution to the country's problems became ever more remote. Now came news of a further development that would speed the country towards outright civil war. In 1641, Ireland exploded into rebellion.
The cause of the rebellion in Ireland was the constant movement of English Protestants into Ulster. This was seen as not so much a religious venture as more a financial venture by many English entrepreneurs, some of whom were Puritans as well. Now, set against this and the creation of a two-tier society in Ireland, you have a growing development of links between Dublin and England. The Irish Catholics start to fear an imposition on them of the English religion. They're worried about their Catholicism in the way that the English worried about their Protestantism. Consequently, you get this explosion. Dungannon, Montclair and Newry all rebel. There is murder, there's raping, there's burning and pillage.
This meant that an army would have to be formed to try and restore order or a semblance of control in Ireland. And this again proved a crucial issue in 1641. Who would control the army? Could the king be trusted to control it? Could he be trusted not to use it against opponents in England Well, most of these opponents did not think so. Equally, from the king's point of view, it was unacceptable to have a royal army in which he had no power. So the issues of control of the army and the settlement of the church proved the crucial precipitants of a crisis within a context of a general lack of trust.
The pace of events quickened further when, in January 1642, King Charles, encouraged by Henrietta Maria, attempted to impeach and arrest 5 leading members of the opposition. They were Pym, Hampden, Hazelrig, Hollis and Strode. The attempted arrest was a tragic farce. The 5 members had long since escaped by boat. For the first time, a reigning monarch entered the House of Commons only to find himself humiliated.
Well, I see the birds have flown. I do expect from you that you shall return unto me as soon as they are returned hither. If not, I shall seek them myself, for their treason is foul, and such a one as you shall thank me to discover. But I assure you, on the word of a king, I never did intend any force, but shall proceed against them in a legal and fair way, for I never meant any other.
It soon became obvious to the king and his followers that the 5 members would never be arrested, and that the force of militia gathering in London in support of Parliament was more than capable of overpowering the royal guard. Faced now with the outright hostility of the people of London and fearful for the safety of Henrietta Maria, the king and his family fled from the capital on the 10th of January, the very day that Pym and his fellow members of Parliament made a triumphant return to Westminster.
Charles actually fled from London. He moved initially west to Hampton Court, but then soon after he departed, he moved north, and he ended up in spring 1642 in York, that became his effectively northern rival capital for much of the spring and summer of 1642. It's this geographical separation of the king and his court and his supporters from Parliament, and the continuing critics of the king in Parliament continue to sit in London, that allows a separation of the two parties. They're no longer even talking, they're no longer communicating in a realistic fashion, and it's another step towards civil war.
On St. George's Day 1642, from his new base at York, the king sent out troops in an attempt to seize the city of Hull, wherein lay great stockpiles of arms and ammunition stored for use in the Scottish War. If the king had expected subservience or cooperation, he was sorely disappointed. The governor, Sir John Hotham, refused to open the gates of the city. The point of no return had been reached. By placing military forces under their own control, the opposition lay itself open to charges of treason, should the king ever be in a position to govern once more with unfettered power. Even at this late stage, however, there were still some moves towards conciliation. Parliament sent a request for temporary control of the militia to the king. His reply was unequivocal.
By God, not for an hour. You have asked that of me in this, which was never asked of a king, and with which I will not trust my wife and children.
Over the summer of 1642, there was furious activity about the country. People were organising local royalist parties, people were organising support for the Parliament side. There was a struggle for control over the local trained band regiments. There was a flurry of pamphlets stating this position, that position. Charles was in York gathering support. The support was very, very slow, and it must have been principally because of the way that people were worrying about their local issues rather than the big picture.
There were attempts at the outset in a number of counties, Cheshire is a good example, an example that has been studied, to actually try and get agreements to keep the war somewhere else. These agreements failed for a simple reason. As in other civil wars, it's the activists, or if you want to use the phrase, the fanatics, who drive the pace and force people to take one side or another.
Neither side experienced overwhelming enthusiasm when they set out in the towns and countries to recruit during summer 1642. But against that, it has to be said, this is this stage of voluntary recruitment. The armies went around, or officers went around, offering regular pay. Because of the level of commitment, because of the level of unemployment perhaps at this time, a significant number of men were willing to sign up and voluntarily go off to fight for king or parliament. By the late summer, early autumn of 1642, both sides had volunteer armies numbering somewhere between perhaps 20, 25, maybe up to 30,000 men.
On the 22nd of August, 1642, all hope of avoiding war disappeared when the king finally raised his standard at Nottingham. The English Civil War, the Great Rebellion, had finally begun. Perhaps it was an omen that the royal standard was blown down by high winds that very night. Desperately short of money, arms and ammunition, the royalist cause generally enjoyed its greatest support in the west and north of England and Wales, and the king travelled to Shrewsbury to join up with recruits based there. On the 23rd of September, the first action came at Powick Bridge, near Worcester, when royalist horses commanded by the king's nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, met 10 troops of parliamentary horse under Colonel John Brown. "2,000 men did battle in what became a confused and farcical skirmish that nonetheless claimed 150 lives. After the battle, Prince Rupert joined his uncle at Shrewsbury, while the parliamentary forces under the Earl of Essex marched on and occupied Worcester. The two sides would not have to wait long to come to grips again, for the scene was now set for the first great pitched battle of the English Civil War. It would come in October 1642 in the beautiful Warwickshire countryside at Edge Hill.